There's a city where silence has replaced laughter, where the sound of busy markets, schools, and prayer calls has been drowned out by airstrikes and gunfire. Khartoum, once home to over 6 million people, was a thriving crossroads of trade, culture, and history. But today it stands as a graveyard of memories, families gone, neighborhoods erased, life itself turned to rubble. In a single morning, peace vanished. April 15th, 2023, the day Sudan's capital woke to the sound of war. Within hours, the skyline burned. By nightfall, thousands were dead, millions fled, and one of Africa's most tragic wars reignited, a war most of the world has chosen to ignore. But to understand how a nation once full of promise descended into chaos, we have to go back to the roots of greed, betrayal, and power that have haunted Sudan for generations. This is the story of a country torn apart not just by bullets, but by ambition. A story where global powers quietly take sides, where hunger is used as a weapon, and where the ghosts of colonial borders still decide who lives and who dies. This is Sudan's unseen war. Before today's chaos, Khartoum was a city of connection. Rail lines ran to Egypt, Port Sudan, and El Obeid. Students filled universities. Tourists admired the meeting of the blue and white Nile, and for decades, life thrived between its rivers. But everything changed on that fateful April morning. Gunfire cracked the air, explosions echoed through the streets. People ran with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and within days, millions were displaced. The city they once called home was gone. But how did it come to this? To answer that, we must go back to where Sudan's long history of division began. Sudan's story doesn't start with its independence in 1956. It stretches much further back to a time before European colonizers drew their artificial borders, before the names North and South even existed. This land once belonged to a powerful civilization, the Kingdom of Kosha, a rival to ancient Egypt. Around 750 BC, Kushite kings achieved the impossible. Led by King Pi, they marched north, conquered Egypt, and ruled as pharaohs, creating what historians call the 25th dynasty, the era of the Black Pharaohs. For nearly a century, Sudanese kings ruled the Nile Valley, restoring temples, erecting pyramids, and shaping an empire whose legacy still stands today in the sands of Marua site that, interestingly, has more pyramids than Egypt itself. But empires rise and empires fall. The Kushites were eventually defeated by the Assyrians, fading into history as centuries passed. Sudan's crossroads became a meeting ground for two worlds, African and Arab. By the 7th century, Islam spread across the region, carried by merchants and conquerors. Over time, the religion fused with local traditions, creating a unique identity neither fully Arab nor purely African, something distinctly Sudanese. By the 19th century, this cultural mosaic became a battleground for empires. The Ottoman Turks, ruling through Egypt, claimed Sudan as part of their realm, extracting gold, ivory, and enslaving tens of thousands. But the Sudanese would not stay silent. Oppression gave birth to resistance and resistance to revolution. In the 1880s, a man named Mohamed Ahmad, known as the Mahdi, declared himself the chosen redeemer of Islam. He launched a holy war against the Ottoman Egyptian rule. His followers, the Ansar, swept across Sudan, defeating powerful armies and famously killing the British General Charles Gordon in Khartoum in 1885. For a brief, shining moment, Sudan was free, ruled by its own people. But freedom, as history often reminds us, rarely lasts. In 1898, the British returned with vengeance. At the Battle of Omdurman, they unleashed machine guns against spear-wielding fighters, a massacre that ended the Mahdist state. Sudan was once again conquered, this time jointly ruled by Britain and Egypt. For the next half-century, this so-called Anglo-Egyptian Sudan would be governed through one of colonialism's most destructive strategies: divide and rule. The British deliberately split the country into two worlds, the largely Arab, Muslim North and the Black Christian South. They banned Arabic in southern schools, discouraged intermarriage, and nurtured mistrust between communities that had once coexisted. It was a political time bomb waiting to explode. When Egypt's monarchy fell in 1952, the winds of independence began to blow. By 1956, Sudan finally broke free. But beneath the euphoria, deep divisions remained. The British had empowered northern elites, sidelined the South, and left behind a nation divided by language, faith, and identity. As the Union Jack was lowered, another war was already beginning. Barely a year after independence, the First Sudanese Civil War erupted. Southern leaders, fearing domination by the Arab North, took up arms. The conflict lasted 17 long years, ending with a fragile peace agreement in 1972. But Sudan's peace never lasts long. In 1983, the government in Khartoum imposed Islamic Sharia law on the entire country, including the Christian South. That decision reignited the conflict, and this time, it would become one of the longest and bloodiest wars of the 20th century, a war that would claim over 2 million lives. And in the chaos of that war, a new figure rose to power: Omar al-Bashir. It was June 30th, 1989. Sudan was collapsing, torn by conflict, poverty, and corruption. And while most of the world was looking elsewhere, tanks rolled into Khartoum. By morning, the government had fallen. The radio crackled to life, and a military officer's voice announced a coup. That officer was Omar Hassan Ahmad al-Bashir. No one knew it then, but he would become one of Africa's longest-serving dictators, ruling Sudan for 30 years with an iron fist. Born in 1944 in a small northern village, Bashir had risen through the army ranks. He fought in Egypt's wars against Israel and later led campaigns against southern rebels. He presented himself as a man of order, promising stability in a time of chaos. But behind his rise stood another shadowy figure named Hassan al-Turabi, an Islamist ideologue who envisioned Sudan as a theocratic state. Together, Bashir and Turabi transformed Sudan into an authoritarian regime driven by religious extremism. Bashir wasted no time consolidating power. He banned political parties, dissolved parliament, silenced the press, and filled prisons with anyone who dared speak out. But his most ruthless ambition lay elsewhere: to win the war in the South at all costs. His army bombed villages, blocked food aid, and used starvation as a weapon. Entire communities were erased. By the late 1990s, over 2 million people were dead. Yet, even as his country burned, Bashir's hunger for control deepened. He built his own private military network, militias loyal only to him. Among them was a group led by a young commander from Darfur, a man known as Hemeti. These forces would later evolve into the Janjaweed, the devils on horseback, infamous for their atrocities in Darfur. When rebellion broke out there in 2003, Bashir's response was brutal. Villages were wiped out, women were raped in systematic campaigns of terror. And by the time the world reacted, 300,000 people were already dead. The United Nations called it ethnic cleansing. The United States called it genocide. And in 2009, the International Criminal Court charged Bashir with war crimes and crimes against humanity, making him the first sitting head of state in history to face such charges. But Bashir didn't flinch. Protected by his generals and Islamist allies, he remained untouchable. He simply rebranded his militias, calling them the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, and gave Hemeti full control. Soon, that militia became not just a tool of terror, but a business empire controlling gold mines, smuggling routes, and mercenary networks across the region. When South Sudan finally gained independence in 2011, Sudan lost 75% of its oil revenue. The economy collapsed, inflation soared, and bread and fuel became luxuries. By 2018, ordinary people had had enough. Protests erupted first over rising prices, then over 3 decades of dictatorship. Crowds filled Khartoum chanting, "Freedom, peace, justice." And this time, the revolution wouldn't stop. Bashir unleashed his security forces, but even they began to turn on him. His 2 main armed units, the Sudanese Armed Forces under General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and Hemeti's RSF, refused to defend him. And so, after 30 years of tyranny, Omar al-Bashir was finally overthrown on April 11, 2019. People poured into the streets, celebrating what they believed was a new beginning. But in Sudan, history always finds a way to repeat itself. Even with Bashir gone, the struggle for power was far from over. After Bashir's fall, the streets of Khartoum erupted with joy. Men and women danced, waved flags, and sang songs of freedom. For a moment, it felt as though Sudan had finally broken its curse. The dictator, who had ruled with fear for 30 years, was gone, and the people believed a new dawn had arrived. But as the celebrations echoed through the capital, another reality was already forming behind closed doors. Power, once again, was being divided among generals, businessmen, and foreign hands. The revolution had toppled a man, not the system that made him. In the weeks that followed, a transitional council was formed, a fragile alliance between the military and civilians. At its head stood General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, commander of the Sudanese armed forces. Beside him was his deputy, the man who had helped remove Bashir, General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hemeti. On paper, they were partners working to guide Sudan toward democracy. In truth, they were rivals waiting for their moment to strike. Hemeti was not a traditional general. Born into a poor camel-trading family in Darfur, he rose from obscurity to power through brutality and loyalty. His rapid support forces were forged in the fires of the Darfur conflict, notorious for burning villages and executing civilians. Bashir had used him as a weapon of fear. Now Hemeti wielded that weapon for himself. His troops were better paid, better armed, and fiercely loyal. He controlled Sudan's richest gold mines and a vast mercenary network that fought in Yemen for the Saudi-led coalition. Money and weapons flowed to him in a steady stream, turning him into one of the most powerful men in Africa. Burhan, meanwhile, represented the old army establishment, the state's backbone, disciplined but fractured, weary from years of corruption. The two men needed each other to keep the revolution in check, but they never trusted one another. For months, Sudan balanced on a knife's edge. Civilian leaders pushed for elections, for accountability, for a new constitution that would finally give power to the people. But the generals stalled. They had fought too long to give up control now. Then came the massacre. On June 3, 2019, peaceful protesters camped outside military headquarters demanding civilian rule. Soldiers surrounded them before dawn. What happened next would scar the nation forever. RSF fighters opened fire, burned tents, and threw bodies into the Nile. More than 100 people were killed in a single morning. Women were assaulted, medics beaten, journalists silenced. The message was clear: the generals would not let go. International pressure forced the military to negotiate. A power-sharing deal was reached later that year, a fragile balance between civilians and the two military factions. A transitional government was formed under Prime Minister Abdel Fattah, a respected economist. The world applauded. Sanctions were lifted, aid flowed in, and Sudan was briefly seen as a nation on the path to democracy. But beneath the surface, old rivalries never died. Burhan's army still controlled key state institutions, while Hemeti's RSF expanded its business empire: gold exports, smuggling routes, and foreign contracts. They pretended to cooperate, but every meeting, every handshake was a test of patience. Then the pandemic struck, the economy crumbled, and hunger returned. Protests erupted again, this time accusing the military of betrayal. In October 2021, Burhan decided he had waited long enough. Tanks rolled into Khartoum once more. Soldiers arrested Prime Minister Hamdan and dissolved the civilian government. Another coup, another broken promise? But unlike before, this coup divided the generals themselves. Hemeti initially supported Burhan, but he saw an opportunity. The RSF had grown stronger than the regular army, richer and more independent. He no longer needed to play second. Over the next year, the tension between them grew unbearable. The two men began stockpiling weapons, recruiting new fighters, and building alliances with foreign powers. Egypt backed Burhan, the career soldier, a man they saw as reliable. The United Arab Emirates favored Hemeti, their old partner in the Yemen war. Russia, through the Wagner Group, offered weapons and gold deals to both sides. Sudan, once again, became a chessboard for foreign interests, its leaders mere pieces in a larger game. The people, as always, paid the price. Then came the explosion. On April 15, 2023, the fragile truce shattered. Fighting erupted across Khartoum as the RSF launched coordinated attacks on military bases, airports, and government buildings. The war Burhan and Hemeti had both been preparing for had finally begun. Within hours, artillery thundered across the capital. Smoke rose from neighborhoods, hospitals were shelled, and terrified civilians fled on foot. By nightfall, Sudan was at war with itself. In the chaos, both sides claimed to be defending the revolution. Burhan said he was fighting to protect the state from rebels. Hemeti insisted he was rescuing Sudan from corrupt generals. But the truth was simpler: they were fighting for power. For control of a broken nation, for gold, for pride. As weeks turned into months, the humanitarian disaster grew unbearable. Electricity vanished, water lines were destroyed, and food became scarce. Aid convoys were looted, and medical workers were hunted. Millions fled the capital, walking through battle zones toward Egypt, Chad, and South Sudan. Entire families vanished in the desert. Those who stayed behind lived in darkness, hiding from snipers and bombings. Outside Sudan, the world watched in silence. News coverage faded, attention shifted elsewhere, but the war never stopped. It spread to Darfur, Kordofan, and beyond. Old wounds reopened and ethnic violence returned. In Darfur, reports of massacres re-emerged: villages burned, civilians executed, the same horrors from 2 decades earlier repeating themselves. For the survivors, it was déjà vu. The same militias, the same impunity, only new uniforms. Hemeti's forces, accused of atrocities, denied responsibility, blaming rogue elements. Burhan's army responded with airstrikes, flattening towns where the RSF had taken shelter. Neither side held back. As the conflict dragged on, Sudan's institutions collapsed one by one. Banks shut down, schools closed, courts disappeared. The nation's archives, museums, and hospitals were looted or destroyed. In the ruins of Khartoum, wild dogs roamed streets once filled with children. The city became a ghost capital. Meanwhile, both generals tried to legitimize themselves abroad. Burhan toured neighboring countries, meeting leaders and promising elections after the war. Hemeti, through emissaries, reached out to Gulf states and even Western diplomats, portraying himself as a reformer. But behind these performances, the suffering deepened. Famine loomed. Cholera spread. And in the refugee camps, children died of hunger before their 5th birthday. Yet amid this despair, resistance continued. Underground networks of doctors, volunteers, and journalists risked their lives to help others. They smuggled food, evacuated the wounded, and documented atrocities. They became Sudan's last line of defense, the People's Army of Compassion. Despite everything, the spirit that fueled the 2019 revolution refused to die. In whispered meetings and secret broadcasts, young Sudanese still dreamed of a country free from warlords and generals. By the end of 2024, the war showed no sign of ending. The RSF controlled much of Khartoum and Darfur. The army held the east and north. Both sides were exhausted, yet neither willing to surrender. Foreign mediators talked of peace talks, but every negotiation collapsed under the weight of mistrust. Behind the scenes, gold and weapon deals continued. The very same resources that could rebuild Sudan were keeping it enslaved to war. It became clear that Sudan's tragedy was not only a political failure, it was a business, a profitable one. Today, as the world looks away, Sudan stands on the edge of collapse. Its people are scattered across borders, its cities in ruins, its leaders consumed by greed. What began as a fight for democracy has turned into a struggle for survival. The revolution that once inspired hope has become a memory whispered in the dark. But in that darkness, there is still a flicker of light, the belief that someday the guns will fall silent, the generals will be forgotten, and Sudan will finally belong to its people again. Because even in ruins, a nation's soul endures. And though Khartoum may burn today, its story isn't over. Somewhere, beyond the smoke and the silence, Sudan still dreams of freedom.